The cricketer Ollie Robinson was suspended from the England team last week after it emerged that he had put out racist and misogynistic tweets when he was a teenager. He released a video apologising for the comments. Have a look.
On the biggest day of my career so far, I'm embarrassed by the racist and sexist tweets that I've posted over 8 years ago, which have today become public. I want to make it clear that I'm not racist and I'm not sexist. I deeply regret my actions and I'm ashamed of making such remarks. I was thoughtless and irresponsible, and regardless of my state of mind at the time, my actions were inexcusable. Since that period, I've matured as a person and fully regret the tweet. Today should be about my efforts on the field and the pride of making my Test debut, but my thoughtless behaviour in the past has tarnished this.
So does the punishment fit the crime, or is this another example of cancel culture getting out of control? To discuss, I'm joined by Douglas Murray, the Spectator's associate editor, and James Forsyth, the Spectator's political editor. James, can you talk us through what happened?
So Ollie Robinson is a 27-year-old cricketer who now plays for Sussex, and he made his England debut in last week's Test match between England and New Zealand. He took a couple of wickets, but at the end of the first day's play, it came out that when he was a kind of 18, 19-year-old, he'd sent a bunch of crass tweets, bad taste jokes, and that was particularly embarrassing for the ECB, because the England Wales Cricket Board, because all the players before the game had lined up wearing kind of anti-discrimination t-shirts. Then at the end of the match, in which Robinson was probably one of England's better players, the ECB announced that they were suspending Robinson from all international cricket pending an investigation. I think what is particularly tough here is that Robinson is now 27, and he didn't have an easy start to his cricketing career. He was sacked by Yorkshire because of kind of poor timekeeping and general bad attitude. So while he hasn't been punished specifically for the tweets that he sent, he has paid a price for that phase in his life and the kind of general lack of seriousness in his approach to life. And I think that's why the ECB's punishment feels disproportionate.
Douglas, Robinson has explicitly apologised for the tweets which he admits were wrong. You've written that this saga shows that we are unforgiving in the way our society is treating people now. What do you mean by that?
Well, the first thing is, as James just referred to, the fact that this should be done on what would have been Robinson's proudest day of his career to date, his first day playing for England in such a Test match. And I think it's, for a lot of people, it just looks like an extraordinarily retributive thing to do. The timing is so vengeful. And going back to what James just referred to in the actual story, we're talking about tweets from 10 years ago, bad taste jokes, basically banter from a young man who seemed not to realise that Twitter was not a medium to communicate with your mates, but was a broadcasting medium to the whole world. These tweets, by the way, at the time weren't even picked up. I mean, they got sort of 1 and 2 likes and things like that. So they didn't gain him anything, but here they are 10 years later looking like they could crash his career. The reason I say that there's something deeply vengeful about it and disturbing about it is not just that element of it, but what's expected afterwards. He was invited to read out a prepared statement before the camera in a scene which I thought looked positively Pyongyang-esque, as he read out his formal apology, expressed how into diversity he actually is, and so on. Here was a young man basically sort of begging for his career, and then he was suspended anyway. That's what I find so disturbing about it. It's not just the sort of archaeological offence business. It's just the fact that, as I've written quite a lot before, we live in a society that's really good on the vengeance. It's really good on the offence archaeology. It's really good at punishing people for erring once in a statement. But we spend no time thinking about how people are meant to redeem themselves.
Yeah, I think Douglas has a very fair point there, which is Ollie Robinson doesn't try and defend his remarks, and he didn't make these remarks as an England cricketer. And I mean, there is a question about how far back we go. But there's another case now involving an unnamed England cricketer and tweets he sent before the age of 16. So how far back into people's pasts are we going? I also think there's an element here of a lack of media savviness. I think if Robinson had maybe a more worldly wise agent around him, for example, he'd have said to him, look, you're going to get a lot more media attention playing for England than you do playing for Sussex. So I suggest you just delete all that social media stuff. Delete whatever. Let's not bother going back through it to see what's there. Just delete it all. I think that's going to become a much more common reaction from people when they know that they're about to be propelled to sudden fame.
One of the other things, by the way, about this that's so disturbing, I think, is this assumption that, our cricketers, our sportsmen, if they represent the national team, they do represent the nation in some way, but they're not a clerical class. I know some people in sports these days seem to think that they are, and think that they have to effectively preach to the terraces. But they're not a clerical class. And I have a question over why it is that we expect them to be these sorts of purer than pure figures. We have a situation at the moment where there are MPs in Parliament who are actually in our legislative bodies who have said much worse things than Ollie Robinson did. Ollie Robinson did this bad taste banter 10 years ago. Less time ago than that, Zara Sultana, the Labour MP, was tweeting out anti-Jewish racist remarks on Twitter. Now I'm much more disturbed by racist Twitter histories in the House of Commons than I am inappropriate banter from members of the England cricket team. But it seems to be so easy to sort of crush a young cricketer's career, hound some sportsman or woman. And I think there's something completely off about this. I don't look to the England cricket team for morality or ethics or behaviour. I don't want any of that from them. I don't want it from the terraces. I don't want it from the football teams.
James, let's get into the politics of this. Douglas raises the double standard point, but ministers are now getting involved. Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden said that the cricket board went over the top in its decision to suspend Robinson. Do you think he should be intervening?
I must admit, I am wary about both sport getting into politics and politics getting into sport. I think that is where this gets tricky. I think it would be much healthier if there was less politics in sport and politicians were taking less of an interest in this kind of question. There are various countries around the world at various points in their history where the national governments have leaned quite heavily on the selection of the cricket team and the like. And I think that would obviously be an absurd route to go down. But I think there is something going on here, which is the reaction just does seem so disproportionate, seeing that Robinson seems to be genuinely contrite for what he said. And I think there is a question, as Douglas said, how do we do forgiveness? At what point can someone say something that is regarded as being enough? And I think having your Test match debut, the proudest moment of your career to date, spoiled in this way, that seems like a fairly hefty punishment already.
Let's open this up slightly more widely, because it's not just Oliver Dowden who jumped into the culture wars this week. Gavin Williamson also waded into a debate over an Oxford college that wants to take down a picture of the Queen. Is this part of Number 10's strategy now, James, that they're going to weigh into the culture wars more, and perhaps they're not going to wait for Labour to prompt them to do so?
I think the government's attitude to the culture wars has always been to wait, to be responsive, to wait for something to happen that most people will consider silly. This Oxford row is spectacularly stupid. You've got the middle combination room at Magdalden College, Oxford, deciding to remove a picture of the Queen on the basis that you can't disentangle her from the state from colonialism. And if you want to go down this argument about historical privilege and all this, I think you would argue that it's impossible to disentangle Magdalden College, Oxford from it by that logic. They should remove themselves. So it is a truly absurd row. But I also think that that the government wading into it has a certain silliness to it, because student unions, let alone middle combination rooms, have done daft things throughout history, and in some ways there can't be that much. I think it is remarkable the spectacular level of interest that this gesture, and it is a gesture, has generated.
It's a very interesting question, this, about the culture wars and the government putting into it, because there's something that I think a lot of our viewers will be aware of that goes on here. The left fights vicious sectarian culture wars on a daily basis. And then whenever anyone of the right does anything pushing back, there are two moves that the radical left makes. They either say, oh, how dare you play a culture war, or they say you're playing a culture war against a problem that doesn't exist, which happens to be manifested daily in their own behaviour. And so when people sort of get into this whole sort of should government get engaged in it, the answer is that the government should stand up for the traditions and the people of the United Kingdom. You know, the government of the United Kingdom is not an NGO. It's not a mere distributor of funds in a multinational level. It is the government of the United Kingdom. It should stand up for the traditions and the good history of our country. I think it is often the case that there are silly things, and I agree that the Magdalden College portrait is a relatively silly case because you can always find students doing dumb stuff. But nevertheless, when there are serious questions over publicly funded institutions and the ideological drift of them, then it isn't inappropriate, I think, for ministers and others to take an interest in a generational-long leftward drift, which it would be good to see stopped.
Douglas, some thought that Brexit and Donald Trump were fueling the culture wars, and the dial-down of the event and the man might allow for some breathing space. But culture wars seem to have a much longer shelf life than many would have thought.
That's right. I mean, I never bought that argument that, you know, Donald Trump would leave office and the radical left in America would stop pushing. You know, I never bought that. I think it's the same in the UK. There's a particular ideological agenda which the radical left has. It's the same agenda around the world. They're always pushing for the same boring things. And everywhere the right is slightly stymied in what its response should be. There are perfectly reasonable responses the right can play back. But yeah, it's not as if the ideological left was ever planning to take a break simply because Joe Biden's in office or because the Brexit agreement had been reached.
James, on the other side, Trump certainly used the culture wars to his advantage. Now that he's gone, is there just a gaping Trump-sized hole that others are trying to fill? Or is there room for calmer conversation now between the two sides to discuss how they might tackle the big issues of the day?
I think the remarkable thing when you look at polling of the UK is how small the kind of culture war numbers are. And I think that Douglas is right about where most of this starts, and I think it generally tends to start with a small number of kind of highly committed activists on the left who push for a bunch of things, and then you get some pushback. And I think that, but I think in a way, one of the things, the answer to all of these problems, to my mind, is more education, not less. Let's have a debate about the statues in this country, but let's not rip them down. Let's understand why they are there in the first place, what they represent, why people at the time admired them, why people today might think differently. And I think that you know, contextualisation is a much better approach to this stuff than trying to silence your opponent, pull down statues, no platform people. I think we can, but I think actually in the general public there is far more agreement on cultural questions than you might think. I think that most people broadly accept that this country has been a force for good in the world, but it has a long history, some of which is inglorious and some of which is glorious. And I think that the public understanding of these questions actually kind of much more nuanced often than the elite understanding.
Can I just pick up? I agree with James, but just with one caveat, if I may, about the polling of the public understanding of culture wars. As James knows, there's been several polls recently, a YouGov poll, an Ipsos Mori poll on these issues. And they've been used by a number of people from right and left to say that the public doesn't really care about culture wars issues. And the reason that people have claimed that about this recent polling is the relatively low number of people who, for instance, particularly care either way about particular trans issues. Now, there's an obvious reason for that, which is there's a very small number of trans people in society, and the issue is directly affecting relatively few people in any direction. So it's sort of understandable. The reason I wanted to add the caveat is that the exception in this is a very high level of public awareness and dissatisfaction of the racialization of the rhetoric, specifically the use of white as a pejorative term, the lumping in of all white people into one racial category, and a negative racial category at that. That's very interesting to me because it suggests that in a white majority country, the majority of people have picked up on the fact that in the culture war, there are things being said now of a racially reprehensible nature which rub the majority up the wrong way. And if I were the radical left pushing some of this culture war stuff at the moment, I would look at those polls and begin to worry.